Hello, good evening, good morning, or whatever time of day it is that you see this video. so, um, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had a little bit of a speech the other day in which he did not do what everyone thought he was going to do. Everybody thought he was going to drop out and endorse Trump. That's not exactly what he did. Instead, he said he was suspending his campaign and removing his name from the swing states. So those that wanted to vote for him in red or blue states that weren't battleground states would still be able to vote for him with no problems. So here in Idaho, we could vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with no problems at all because it's going to go Trump. That's not a concern. In Utah, it's going to go Trump. It doesn't matter. And when it was the 2008 election and the 2012 election, and I did not want to vote for Romney or John McCain because I didn't want to vote for the lesser of two evils, I didn't vote for either of them. And I felt very, very good not voting for either of them. And they lost both times, but they did not lose the state I was in. So even though they were the lesser of the two, well, I don't know, John McCain was pretty dang evil. But I was actually blamed for Obama winning because I did not vote for Romney, even though Romney won Utah by like 60% of the vote or something like that, some insane amount. So I was blamed for Obama winning. I'm fine with that, whatever. I didn't feel like I was throwing my vote away. I felt like I was putting in a protest vote because I didn't want my name associated with those two people. So back to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is giving the opportunity to people in red and blue states to still vote for him. He's hoping, I would say he is hoping, and also his vice presidential candidate, Nicole Shanahan, is hoping to get 5% of the vote in a few of the states to create a viable third party, which I also think would be perfectly fine because, well, and with how horrible the Democratic Party has treated so many people with the lawfare that they've done and everything, I would not be too surprised if they became a third party because people are just fleeing the Democratic Party, it seems. Again, because I'm very conservative and I lean more Republican, I don't really live in the ecosystem of the Democrats, but they have really burned a lot of bridges with all the Democrats that were leaning towards Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because of all the lawfare that they've done against Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Anyway, I'm gonna play his video or his speech. It's 47 minutes long, so I might jump around in it a little bit because that would make for a very long video. But here's Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I'm sorry to keep everybody waiting. 16 months ago, in April of 2023, I launched my campaign for President of the United States. I began this journey as a Democrat, the party of my father, my uncle, the party which I pledged my own allegiance to long before I was old enough to vote. I attended my first Democratic convention at the age of 6 in 1960. And back then, the Democrats were the champions of the Constitution, of civil rights. The Democrats stood against authoritarianism, against censorship, against colonialism, imperialism, and unjust wars. We were the party of labor, of the working class. The Democrats were the party of government transparency and the champion of the environment. Our party was the bulwark against big money interests and corporate power. True to its name, it was the party of democracy. As you know, I left that party in October because it had departed so dramatically from the core values that I grew up with.
So that was the Democratic Party of yesteryear. Let me see. About 8 minutes in. Let's try about here.
The DNC waged continual legal warfare against both President Trump and myself. Each time that our volunteers turned in those towering boxes of signatures needed to get on the ballot, the DNC dragged us into court, state after state, attempting to erase their work and to subvert the will of the voters who had signed those petitions. It deployed DNC-aligned judges to throw me and other candidates off the ballot and to throw President Trump in jail. It ran a sham primary that was rigged to prevent any serious challenge to President Biden. Then, when a predictably bungled debate performance precipitated the palace coup against President Biden, the same shadowy DNC operatives appointed his successor, also without an election. They installed a candidate who was so unpopular with voters that she dropped out in 2020 without winning a single delegate. My uncle and my father both relished debate. They prided themselves on their capacity to go toe-to-toe with any opponent in the battle over ideas. They would be astonished to learn of a Democratic Party presidential nominee who, like Vice President Harris, has not appeared in a single interview or an unscripted encounter with voters for 35 days. This is profoundly undemocratic. How are people to choose when they don't know whom they are choosing? And how can this look to the rest of the world? My father and my uncle were always conscious of America's image abroad because of our nation's role as the template for democracy, the role model for democratic processes, and the leader of the free world. Instead of showing us her substance and character, the DNC and its media organs engineered a surge of popularity for Vice President Harris based upon, well, nothing. No policies, no interviews, no debates, only smoke and mirrors and balloons in a highly produced Chicago circus. There in Chicago, a string of Democratic speakers mentioned Donald Trump 147 times just on the first day. Well, who needs a policy when you have Trump to hate?
I think that is so powerful saying that right there, because it's really true. The two policies that I have heard from the Harris campaign so far is no tax on tips, which she stole from the Trump campaign, and then price controls, which when people started saying, well, that's communism, she went, oh, and she walked it back really quick. Well, the campaign walked it back. She really hasn't talked to anyone because she's not really good off of a teleprompter. If she's on the teleprompter, she's great. If she's in an interview where she's not reading a script, she's not so good. But she's great on that teleprompter.
In contrast, at the RNC convention, President Biden was mentioned only twice in 4 days. I do interviews every day. Many of you have interviewed me. Anybody who asks gets to interview me. Some days I do as many as 10. President Trump, who actually was nominated and won an election, also does interviews daily.
Well, that is one interesting point there. Mark Grobert of America's Untold Stories, a fairly well known YouTube channel / podcast, he attempted to interview RFK Jr., but his campaign wouldn't set up the appointment for some reason. I don't know why. Because Mark Robert actually knows RFK Jr. They're familiar with one another, so it's odd that um, RFK would go on a lot of different shows, but his campaign blocked Mark Robert from actually interviewing someone that is familiar with him already. And funny enough, Mark Robert is at this news conference. He's sitting, I think, on the front row as RFK is talking about this. So, interesting point there.
How did the Democratic Party choose a candidate that has never done an interview or debate during the entire election cycle? We know the answers. They did it by weaponizing the government agencies. They did it by abandoning democracy. They did it by suing the opposition and by disenfranchising American voters. What most alarms me isn't how the Democratic Party conducts its internal affairs or runs its candidates. What alarms me is the resort to censorship and media control and the weaponization of the federal agencies. When a US president colludes with or outright coerces media companies to censor political speech, it's an attack on our most sacred right of free expression, and that's the very right upon which all of our other constitutional rights rest. President Biden mocked Vladimir Putin's 88% landslide in the Russian elections, observing that Putin and his party controlled the Russian press and that Putin prevented serious opponents from appearing on the ballot. But here in America, the DNC also prevented opponents from appearing on the ballot. And our television networks expose themselves as Democratic Party organs. Over the course of more than a year in a campaign where my poll numbers reached at times in the high 20s, the DNC-aligned mainstream media networks maintain a near perfect embargo on interviews with me. During his 10-month presidential campaign in 1992, Ross Perot gave 34 interviews on mainstream networks. In contrast, during the 16 months since I declared, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, and CNN combined gave only 2 live interviews from me. Those networks instead ran a continuous deluge of hit pieces with inaccurate, often vile, pejoratives and defamatory smears. Some of those same networks and colluded with the DNC to keep me off the debate stage. Representatives of those networks are in this room right now, and I'll just take a moment to ask you to consider the many ways that your institutions have abdicated this really sacred responsibility, duty of a free press to safeguard democracy and to challenge always the party in power. Instead of maintaining that posture of fierce skepticism toward authority, your institutions have made themselves government mouthpieces and stenographers for the organs of power. You didn't alone cause the devolution of American democracy, but you could have prevented it. The Democratic Party's censorship of social media was even more of a naked exercise of executive power. This week, a federal judge, Terry Doty, upheld my injunction against President Biden calling the White House's censorship project, quote, the most egregious violation of the First Amendment in the history of the United States of America. Odie's previous 155-page decision details how just 37 hours after he took the oath of office, swearing to uphold the Constitution, President Biden and his White House opened up a portal and then invited the CIA, the FBI, CISA, which is a censorship agency, it's the center of the censorship industrial complex, DHS, the IRS, and other agencies to censor me and other political dissidents on social media. Even today, users who try to post my campaign videos to Facebook or YouTube get messages that this content violates community standards. 2 days after Judge Odie rendered his decision this week, Facebook was still attaching warning labels to an online petition calling on ABC to include me in the upcoming debate. They said that violates community standards, their community standards. The mainstream media was once the guardian of the First Amendment and democratic principles, and has joined this systemic attack on democracy. It also, the media justifies their censorship on the grounds of combating misinformation, but governments and oppressors don't censor lies. They don't fear lies. They fear the truth, and that's what they censor. And I don't want any of this to sound like a personal complaint, because it's not. For me, it's all part of a journey, and it's a journey that I signed up with. But I need to make these observations because I think they're critical for us doing the thing that we need to do as citizens in a democracy to assess where we are in this country and what our democracy still looks like.
The next part I wanted to share, and I've harped on this a few times about how legacy media it's just another arm of our tyrannical government at this point, of the uniparty. Yeah, I hopefully if Trump gets in office, things will change. But with the uniparty involved and the deep state involved, it's going to be very difficult for him to make the changes that would really benefit America. But I think he desperately wants to make those changes, as well as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would prefer to make those changes. If I jump forward, that next part I want to listen to him about is a little bit of history on the Ukraine war.
Initiated by the ambitions of the U.S. neocons invading the Ukraine and then to thwart his Hitler-like march across Europe. I've already described some of my personal experiences and struggles with the government's censorship industrial complex. I want to say a word about the Ukraine war.
There we go.
The military industrial complex has provided us with a familiar comic book justification like they do on every war. That this one is a noble effort to stop a supervillain, Vladimir Putin, invading the Ukraine and then to thwart his Hitler-like march across Europe. In fact, tiny Ukraine is a proxy in a geopolitical struggle initiated by the ambitions of the U.S. neocons for American global hegemony. I'm not excusing Putin for invading Ukraine. He had other options. But the war is Russia's predictable response to the reckless neocon project of extending NATO to encircle Russia, a hostile act. The credulous media rarely explain to Americans that we unilaterally walked away from 2 intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia, and then put nuclear-ready Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland. This is a hostile act. And that the Biden White House repeatedly spurned Russia's offer to settle this war peacefully. The Ukraine war began in 2014 when U.S. agencies overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine and installed a hand-picked pro-Western government that launched a deadly civil war against ethnic Russians in Ukraine. In 2019, America walked away from a peace treaty, the Minsk Agreement, that had been negotiated between Russia and Ukraine by European nations. And then in April of 2022, we wanted the war. In April of 2022, President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Ukraine to force President Zelensky to tear up a peace agreement that he and the Russians had already signed, and the Russians were withdrawing troops from Kiev and Donbass and Lugansk. And that peace agreement would have brought peace to the region and would have allowed Donbass and Lugansk to remain part of Ukraine. President Biden stated that month that his objective in the war was regime change in Russia. His Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin simultaneously explained that America's purpose in the war was to exhaust the Russian army, to degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. These objectives, of course, have nothing to do with what they were telling Americans about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine is a victim in this war, and it's a victim of the West. Since then, of Russia and both Russia and the West. Since then, we have, since tearing up that agreement, forcing Zelensky to tear up the agreement, we've squandered the flower of Ukrainian youth, as many as 600,000 Ukrainian kids, and over 100,000 Russian kids, all of whom we should be mourning, have died, and the Ukraine's infrastructure is destroyed. The war has been a disaster for our country as well. We squandered nearly $200 billion already, and these are badly needed dollars in our communities, suffering communities all over our country. The Nord Stream pipeline sabotage and the sanctions have destroyed Europe's industrial base, which formed the bulwark of U.S. national security. A strong Germany with a strong industry is a much, much stronger deterrent to Russia, and a Germany that is deindustrialized and turned into just an extension of U.S. military base. We've pushed Russia into a disastrous alliance with China and Iran. We're closer to the brink of nuclear exchange than at any time since 1962. And the neocons in the White House don't seem to care at all. Our moral authority and our economy are in shambles, and the war gave rise to the emergence of BRICS, which now threatens to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. This is a first-class calamity for our country. Judging by her bellicose, belligerent speech last night in Chicago, we can assume that President Harris will be an enthusiastic advocate for this and other neocon military adventures. And President Trump says that he will reopen negotiations with President Putin and end the war overnight as soon as he becomes president. This alone would justify my support for his campaign. Last summer, it looked like no candidate was willing to negotiate a quick end to the Ukraine war, to tackle chronic disease epidemic, to protect free speech, our constitutional freedoms, to clean corporate influence out of our government.
So that's what he had to say about the Ukraine war, which from what I know about the recent history from 2014 on, he's pretty spot on. Because of the coup that we did in Ukraine, that kind of started this all happening. Because of the coup, Russia took Crimea, and ever since then, the eastern half of Ukraine has been bombarded by the western half up until Russia, and the eastern half of Ukraine was all predominantly ethnically Russian. So when Russia kept seeing their ethnic countrymen being bombarded, according to the reports that I've seen, that's why they moved in to stop the slaughter of their countrymen. Even though, yes, their countrymen were in a different country, ethnically, they were very similar. And what did Biden and Kamala Harris do to stop it? They did nothing, because they wanted it to happen. Because that way, the people that Biden had been paid, Biden had received money from in Ukraine through Hunter Biden, he was able to pay them back to the tune of $800 billion. I think that's a fairly good return on investment. And a lot of that money is being funneled back into America because that's how money laundering works. Also, if you want to look into FTX and the money laundering through FTX and Ukraine back into the Democratic National Committee, that's a very interesting thing to look at. But yeah, this could have been solved, like he said. I think April of 2022 was when Boris Johnson went over there to make sure that Zelensky ripped up the peace agreement. It could have been solved back then. How many hundreds of thousands of people didn't need to die, but because of our idiotic and tyrannical and psychotic leaders, they died. Not to mention the Nord Stream pipeline being blamed on Russia. Why would Russia want to blow up their own pipeline when all they needed to do was just turn it off? Completely ridiculous. And more all signs point to us, or us in conjunction with Ukraine, doing it, which makes the most sense because that pipeline feeds Germany, doesn't feed Ukraine. So it wouldn't really hurt Ukraine to blow up the pipeline, but it would hurt it would hurt Russia. So that makes sense. So anyway, let me skip forward just a hair.
Less than 2 hours after President Trump narrowly escaped assassination, Callie Means called me on my cell phone. I was then in Las Vegas. Callie is arguably the leading advocate for food safety, for soil regeneration, and for ending the chronic disease epidemic that is destroying America's health and ruining our economy. Callie has exposed the insidious corruption at the FDA, the NIH, the HHS, and the USDA that has caused the epidemic. Callie had been working on and off for my campaign, advising me on those subjects since the beginning. And those subjects have been my primary focus for the last 20 years. I was delighted when Callie told me that day that he had also been advising President Trump. He told me President Trump was anxious to talk to me about chronic disease and other subjects, and to explore avenues of cooperation. He asked if I would take a call from the president. President Trump telephoned me a few minutes later, and I met with him the following day. A few weeks later, I met again with President Trump and his family members and closest advisors in Florida. In a series of long, intense discussions, I was surprised to discover that we are aligned on many key issues. In those meetings, he suggested that we join forces as a unity party. We talked about Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals.
Now that's really exciting to me. That instead of going with some deep state yes men that will talk to him like he's their best friend to his face, but then go behind his back and do exactly the opposite. Going with someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that you know where he's coming from, that he's got a very long track record of actually fighting for the youth. Yeah, he does have some liberal ideas. He's not exactly strong on the Second Amendment. And he's a bit of an environmentalist, which in some ways you could say I'm an environmentalist in that I want clean drinking water. I don't want thick clouds of pollution all over the place. I don't want to deforest the entire world. I want to have a lush garden environment for everyone to live in. It would be safer and happier and healthier for everyone to be that way. But I don't want the government dictating and mandating how many trees I have on my property or what animals I have on my property. That's potentially a little bit of a difference between him and Robert F. Kennedy and myself, is that he would, I think, he would be okay with the government mandating if I cut down a tree or two, or if I didn't want some animals on my property or something like that. Very EPA type of stuff. But maybe he's adjusted that idea. I don't know. But in the past, he's been more pro EPA and not so pro Second Amendment. Typical Democrat.
That arrangement would allow us to disagree publicly and privately and fiercely, if need be, on issues over which we differ, while working together on the existential issues upon which we are in concordance. I was a ferocious critic of many of the policies during his first administration, and there are still issues and approaches upon which we continue to have very serious differences.
So I heard a story, might be apocryphal, might not, in which he had a meeting with Trump during Trump's first presidency, in which Trump said, "Hey, maybe we could have you on a vaccine board or something along those lines to try and figure out about chronic illness." Something like that. After that meeting, Bill Gates went in and shut it all down and said that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a bad idea, something, something, something. And afterwards, Bill Gates gloated about being able to shut it all down really easily because he's trusted for some reason. I am fairly certain it's accurate. I would need to get an exact source on that, but his speech right here kind of indicates something along that. Anyway.
We are aligned with each other on other key issues like ending the forever wars, ending the childhood disease epidemics, securing the border, protecting freedom of speech, unraveling the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, getting the U.S. intelligence agencies out of the business of propagandizing and censoring and surveilling Americans and interfering with our elections. Following my first discussion with President Trump, I tried unsuccessfully to open similar discussions with Vice President Harris. Vice President Harris declined to meet or even to speak with me.
I think that's a huge point right there, that he tried to meet with the Democratic candidate for the presidency, and she refused to even talk to him, refused to meet with him, refused everything, flat out. And I would say that since he traditionally was a Democrat, there might be, or you would think that someone that's the current Democratic nominee would be more closely aligned with what he's thinking. But they refused to even meet with him. And that kind of shows you what her candidacy is like, and potentially what her presidency would be like. Ugh.
Suspending my candidacy is a heart-rending decision for me, but I'm convinced that it's the best hope for the United States. I will continue to work with my colleagues to ensure that we have a are ending the Ukraine war and ending the chronic disease epidemic that is eroding our nation's vitality from the inside, and for finally protecting free speech. I feel a moral obligation to use this opportunity to save millions of American children, above all things. In case some of you don't realize how dire the condition is, our children's health and chronic disease in general, I would urge you to view Dr. Carlson's recent interview with Callie Means and his sister, Dr. Casey Means, who is the top graduate of her class at Stanford Medical School.
Now, I watched that interview between Tucker Carlson and the Means, Callie and his sister. Interesting name for a guy, Callie. Anyway, it was a very, very interesting video. Callie was actually a lobbyist in DC for a few years, and his wife, or not his wife, his sister was a medical doctor, and they've both turned whistleblowers to talk about why chronic illness is happening and how so much of it is related to our current food system, and how processed foods specifically are really causing a lot of the issues that we have. That seed oils in our food are really, really bad for us, that we are not built to eat or consume seed oils. That so many of the chemicals that are in our foods aren't healthy for us. And the interesting connection between our food system and our medical system, how the pharmaceutical companies and our food providers have this weird connection. And both of those industries have a revolving door with the regulatory agencies. So basically, the regulatory agencies are captured by those industries. And if the food makes you sick enough that you need to go to the doctor and you get on some medication for the rest of your life, that'll feed the pharmaceutical industry. Like, I think he's going to talk about Ozempic, and how Ozempic potentially is $1 trillion industry. And there's no reason for you to take Ozempic when it's completely diet-based. All you need to do is not eat horrible food, not get fat, and you don't need to take Ozempic.
This is an issue that affects all of us far more directly and urgently than any culture war issue and all the other issues that we obsess on and that are tearing apart our country. This is the most important issue. Therefore, it has the potential to bring us together. So let me share a little bit about why I believe it's so urgent. Today, 2/3, we spend more on healthcare than any country on earth, twice what they pay in Europe. And yet we have the worst health outcomes of any nation in the world. We're about 79th in health outcomes behind Costa Rica and Nicaragua and Mongolia and other countries. Nobody has a chronic disease burden like we have. And during the COVID epidemic, we had the highest body count of any country in the world. We had 16% of the COVID deaths, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. And CDC.
Now, about the COVID deaths, I don't know how accurate those COVID deaths are, because if you look at charts of COVID deaths and charts of flu deaths, in 2020, there were no flu deaths, unless they've adjusted the charts. The last time I looked at them, it went flu deaths in the thousands, flu deaths in the thousands, flu deaths in the thousands. 2020 came around, zero flu deaths in 2020. And so how many of those flu deaths were just accounted as COVID deaths. And we need to remember that anytime a hospital was able to call something a COVID death, they got like 10 grand from the government. So there was incentives to call them COVID deaths. Like there were a few people that died from COVID, but they also had, a motorcycle accident, but it was a COVID death. I guess they sneezed and then ran into a semi or something like that, or a gunshot wound to the head that was a COVID death. It's a COVID mixed with lead poisoning or something weird. But anyway, I don't know how accurate the statistics are that he's citing at that point, but I do know that as far as obesity goes, the rest of the world is laughing at the US because of how obese we are as a nation.
He says that's because we are the sickest people on earth. We have the highest chronic disease rate on earth. And the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So these were people who had immune system collapse, who had mitochondrial dysfunction. And no other country has anything like this. 2/3 of American adults and children suffer from chronic health issues. 50 years ago, that number was less than 1%. So we've gone from 1% to 66%. In America, 74% of Americans are now overweight or obese, and 50% of our children. 120 years ago, when somebody was obese, they were sent to the circus. There were case reports done about them. Obesity was almost unknown. In Japan, the childhood obesity rate is 3% compared to 50% here. Half of Americans have pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. When my uncle was president, I was a boy, juvenile diabetes was effectively non-existent. A typical pediatrician would see one case of diabetes during his entire career, a 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And the mitochondrial disorder that caused diabetes also causing Alzheimer's, which is now classified as diabetes. And it's costing this country more than our military budget every year. There's been an explosion of neurological illnesses that I never saw as a kid: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, Asperger's, autism. In the year 2000, the autism rate was 1 in 1,500. Now, autism rates in kids are 1 in 36, according to CDC nationally. Nobody's talking about this. 1 in every 22 kids.
I just wanted to show you this. So if you look at the number of influenza deaths in the United States from 2010 to 2023, it's odd that it goes 27,000, 25,000, down to 4,000, and then back up to 21,000 the next year. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying it's a bit suspect. I just wanted to pop that in there.
California has autism. And this is a crisis that 77% of our kids are too disabled to serve in the United States military. What is happening to our country? And why isn't this in the headlines every single day? There's nobody else in the world that is experiencing this. This is only happening in America. About 18%, and by the way, there has been no change in diagnosis, which the industry sometimes like to say. There has been no change in screening. This is a change in incidence. In my generation, 70-year-old men, the autism rates are about 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, 1 in 34. I'll repeat, in California, 1 in 22. Why are we letting this happen? Why are we allowing this to happen to our children? These are the most precious assets that we have in this country. How can we let this happen to them? About 18% of American teens now have fatty liver disease. That's like 1 out of every 5. That disease, when I was a kid, only affected late-stage alcoholics who were elderly. Cancer rates are skyrocketing in the young and the old. Young adult cancers are up 79%. 1 in 4 American women is on antidepressant medication. 40% of teens have a mental health diagnosis. And 15% of high schoolers are on Adderall, and 500,000 children on SSRIs. So what's causing this suffering? I'll name 2 culprits. First and the worst is ultra-processed food. About 70% of American children's diet is ultra-processed. That means industrial manufactured in a factory. These foods consist primarily of processed sugar, ultra-processed grains, and seed oils. Laboratory scientists who many of them formerly worked for the cigarette industry, which purchased all the big food companies in the 1970s and 80s, deployed thousands of scientists to figure out new chemicals to make the food more addictive. And these ingredients didn't exist 100 years ago. Humans aren't biologically adapted to eat them. Hundreds of these chemicals are now banned in Europe, but ubiquitous in American processed foods.
Yeah, so American food is illegal to eat in or to be purchased in Europe. American food is illegal to be purchased in Europe because of the toxins, the pollutants that are found in our food. It's an interesting point there.
The second culprit is toxic chemicals in our food, in our medicine, in our environment. Pesticides, food additives, pharmaceutical drugs, and toxic waste permeate every cell of our bodies. The assault on our children's cells and hormones is unrelenting. To name just one problem, many of these chemicals increase estrogen. Because young children are ingesting so many of these hormone disruptors, America's puberty rate is now occurring at age 10 to 13, which is 6 years earlier than girls were reaching puberty in 1900. Our country has the earliest puberty rates of any continent on the earth. And no, this isn't because of better nutrition. This is not normal. Breast cancer is also estrogen driven, and it now strikes 1 in 8 women. We are mass poisoning all of our children and our adults. And considering the grievous human cost of this tragic epidemic of chronic disease, it seems almost crass to mention the damage it does to our economy. But I'll say, it is crippling the nation's finances. When my uncle was president, our country spent $0 on chronic disease. Today, government healthcare spending is almost all for chronic disease. And it's double the military budget. And it is the fastest growing budget item in the federal budget. Chronic disease costs more to the economy as a whole, costs at least $4 trillion, 5 times our military budget. And that's a 20% drag on everything we do and everything we aspire to. Or in minority communities suffer disproportionately. People who worry about DEI or about bigotry of any kind, this dwarfs anything. We are poisoning the poor. We are systematically poisoning minorities across this country. Industry lobbyists have made sure that most of the food stamp lunch program, about 70% of food stamps and 70 or 77% of school lunches are processed foods. There's no vegetables. There's nothing that you would want to eat. We are just poisoning the poor citizens, and that's why they have the highest chronic disease burden of anybody, any demographic in our country, and the highest in the world. The same food industry lobbied to make sure that nearly all agricultural subsidies go to commodity crops that are the feedstock of processed food industry. These policies are destroying small farms and they're destroying our soils. We give about, I think, 8 times as much in subsidies to tobacco and we do to fruits and vegetables. It makes no sense. If we want a healthy country, the good news is that we can change all this. We can change it very, very quickly. America can get healthy again. To do that, we need to do 3 things. First, we need to root out the corruption in our health agencies. Second, we need to change incentives in our healthcare system. And third, we need to inspire Americans to get healthy again. 80% of NIH grants go to people with conflicts of interest. These are the people, virtually everybody who sits, Joe Biden just appointed a new panel to NIH to decide the food recommendations. And they're all people who are from the industry. They're all people who are from the processed food companies. They're deciding what Americans, here is healthy. And the recommendations on the food pyramid and what goes to our school lunch programs, what go to the program, the Swiss program, the food stamp programs. They're all corrupted and conflicted individuals. These agencies, the FDA, USDA, and CDC, all of them are controlled by giant for-profit corporations. 75% of the FDA's funding doesn't come from taxpayer, it comes from pharma. And pharma executives and consultants and lobbyists cycle in and out of these agencies with President Trump's backing. I'm going to change that. We're going to staff these agencies with honest scientists and doctors who are free from industry funding. We're going to make sure the decisions of consumers, doctors, and patients are informed by unbiased science. A sick child is the best thing for the pharmaceutical industry. When American children or adults get sick with a chronic condition, they're put on medication for their entire life. Imagine what will happen when Medicare starts paying for Ozempic, which costs $1,500 a month, and it's being recommended for children as young as 6, all for a condition, obesity, that is completely preventable and barely even existed 100 years ago. And 74% of Americans are obese. The cost, if all of them took their Ozempic prescription, is $3 trillion a year. This is a drug that is made by Novo Nordisk, the biggest company in Europe. It's a Danish company, and the Danish government does not recommend it. It recommends change in diet to treat obesity and exercise. And in our country, the recommendation now is for Ozempic to children at age 6. Novo Nordisk is the biggest company in Europe, and virtually its entire value is based upon its projections of what it's going to sell, the Ozempic it's going to sell to America. And we have the food lobbyists have a bill in front of Congress today that is backed by the White House, backed by Vice President Harris and President Biden to allow this to happen. This $3 trillion cost that is going to bankrupt our country. For a fraction of that amount, we could buy organic food for every American family, 3 meals a day, and eliminate diabetes altogether. We're going to bring healthy food back to school lunches. We're going to stop subsidizing the worst foods with our agricultural subsidies. We're going to get toxic chemicals out of our food. We're going to reform the entire food system. And for that, we need new leadership in Washington. Because unfortunately, both the Democrats and the Republican parties are in cahoots with the big food producers, Big Pharma and Big Ag, which are among the DNC's major donors. Vice President Harris has expressed no interest in addressing this issue. 4 more years of Democratic rule will complete the consolidation of corporate and neocon power, and our children will be the ones who suffer most. I got involved with chronic disease 20 years ago, not because I chose to or wanted to. it was essentially thrust upon me. It was an issue that should have been central to the environmental movement. I was a central leader at that time, but it was widely ignored by all the institutions, including the NGOs, who should have been protecting our kids against toxins. It was an orphaned issue, and I had a weakness for orphans. I watched generations of children get sicker and sicker. I had 11 siblings, and I had 7 kids myself. I was conscious of what was happening in their classrooms and to their friends, and I watched these sick kids, these damaged kids. In that generation, almost all of them are damaged. And nobody in power seemed to care or to even notice. For 19 years, I prayed every morning that God would put me in a position to end this calamity. The chronic disease crisis was one of the primary reasons for my running for president, along with ending censorship in the Ukraine war. It's the reason I've made the heart-wrenching decision to suspend my campaign and to support President Trump. This decision is agonizing for me because of the difficulties it causes my wife and my children and my friends. But I have the certainty that this is what I've meant to do. And that certainty gives me internal peace, even in storms. If I'm given the chance to fix the chronic disease crisis and reform our food production, I promise that within 2 years, we will watch chronic disease burden lift dramatically. We will make Americans healthy again. Within 4 years, America will be a healthy country. We will be stronger, more resilient, more optimistic, and happier. I won't fail in doing this. Ultimately, the future, however it happens, is in God's hands, and in the hands of the American voters and those of President Trump. If President Trump is elected and honors his word, the vast burden of chronic disease that now demoralizes and bankrupts the country will disappear. This is a spiritual journey for me. I reached my decision through deep prayer, through hard-nosed logic, and I asked myself, what choices must I make to maximize my chances to save America's children and restore national health? I felt that if I refused this opportunity, I would not be able to look myself in the mirror, knowing that I could have saved lives of countless children and reversed this country's chronic disease epidemic. I'm 70 years old. I may have a decade to be effective. I can't imagine that President Harris would allow me or anyone to solve these dire problems. After 8 years of President Harris, any opportunity for me to fix the problem will be out of my reach forever. President Trump has told me that he wants this to be his legacy. I'm choosing to believe that this time he will follow through. His son, his biggest donors, his closest friends, and all support this objective. I joining the Trump campaign will be a difficult sacrifice for my wife and children, but worthwhile if there's even a small chance of saving these kids. Ultimately, the only thing that will save our country and our children is if we choose to love our kids more than we hate each other. That's why I launched my campaign.
That's big.
To unify America. My dad and uncle made such an enduring mark on the character of our nation, not so much because of any particular policies that they promoted, but because they were able to inspire profound love for our country and to fortify our sense of ourselves as a national community held together by ideals. They were able to put their love into the intentions and hearts of ordinary Americans and to unify a national populist movement of Americans, blacks and whites, Hispanics, urban and rural Americans. They inspired affection and love and high hopes and a culture of kindness that continue to radiate among Americans from their memory. That's the spirit on which I ran my campaign and that I intend to bring into the campaign of President Trump. Instead of vitriol and polarization, I will appeal to the values that unite us, the goals that we could achieve if only we weren't at each other's throats. Most unifying theme for all Americans is that we all love our children. If we all unite around that issue now, we can finally give them the protection, the health, and the future that they deserve. Thank you all very much.
So yeah, that was his talk. The reception for that talk seemed to go over very well with everyone that I've seen. That afternoon or that evening, Trump had this to say.
He is a great person. I've known him for so long. For the past 16 months, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I can't really play that song because the Foo Fighters are really upset that Trump did. But he invited Robert F. Kennedy out onto the stage, and it was a very, very warm welcome from the MAGA crowd with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. there. And he spoke for a few minutes, and everybody was very, very happy to have him there. Maybe a warmer reception than Trump himself got.
He deserves it. He deserves it.
And one of my favorite reporters, Ben Swan, he had a little bit to say about this.
President Trump, the causes were free speech, a war in Ukraine, and the war on our children.
Kennedy had been polling around 5%, which means those votes could decide the election in favor of Trump, especially in swing states that are so razor thin. Rumors are swirling that Kennedy is aiming for a cabinet position in exchange for his endorsement, with his eyes set on the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. It would be a powerful fit. If that were to happen, he'd be in charge of the FDA, the NIH, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, plus 10 other government agencies.
And that's my hope, is he is put in charge of HHS and just cleans house, just really strips all of the connection between the big food and big pharma out of those agencies, so they are actually independent regulatory agencies. Now, the libertarian in me says we shouldn't have those agencies at all. It should be privatized, and that way, like a Consumer Report, more of a situation like UL is for electricians. That would be my preference. But if the government agencies are going to be running, I want them to be running as they should be, and not as a propaganda arm for big food and big pharma.
Kennedy has previously discussed his desire to rehaul every one of those offices. Here's what he said he would do if he had won the White House.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to NIH during my first week in office, and I'm going to assemble all the division chairs and the branch chairs. And I'm going to say to them, we're going to do something different.
That something different would be to free the NIH from interference and control of Big Pharma. At this point, it's not exactly clear what position, if any, Kennedy will take in a potential Trump government. But whatever position he takes, there is no question he will have a different take on it than anyone in the past. Well, RFK.
So yeah, that would be just so great. So great if he was able to take over HHS. I would just be so happy. So there were a few news agencies that were broadcasting his his video or his announcement.
Pictures from
And here's MSNBC.
Pictures from Phoenix, Arizona, where Kennedy is expected to.
He is talking, and they are muting him and talking over him instead of actually hearing what he has to say.
To now dropping out and relinquishing the title of Democrat. He had a series of complaints about the party. We're, of course, going to continue watching his remarks. There's a back and forth over whether he's going to endorse former President Donald Trump. We're going to break that down on the other side of a quick break. Stay with.
So, yeah, they cut to commercial. They were talking over him. And a lot of that was during the part where he was talking about how they were the people that were colluding with the DNC to prevent him from getting any airtime, any interviews, and really causing his poll numbers to stay between 5 and 20%, depending on the poll and on the time. It's really pernicious what they did there. Shortly after he endorsed Trump, the Daily Mail came out with a nice little hit piece on him that RFK is accused of being a cocaine dealer in Harvard. And the funny thing about this is that the classmate or the former classmate that spoke out, he also said he never did cocaine. So either he's lying or he's lying. One or the other. I'm not sure which, but one of those two things, he's lying. Then here's a funny little thing. This lady, MAGA can have RFK Jr. The Democrats have Adam Kinzinger. And the replies to that are just there we go. They can keep him. Deal. Cool. We'll throw in Liz Cheney for good measure. LOL. They can have him. Take Liz Cheney too. They can have Adam without us getting anyone. We didn't like him anyway. That a nice meme. I didn't see that one. That's a pretty good one. Yeah, no one thought that was bad. Then Robert F. Kennedy's family decided that they wanted to send out a little statement about it. We want an America filled with hope and bound together by a shared vision of a brighter future, a future defined by individual freedom, economic promise, and national pride. We believe in Harrison Waltz. Our brother Bobby's decision to endorse Trump today is a betrayal of the values that our father and our family hold most dear. It is a sad ending to a sad story. And again, the responses, betraying your own brother speaks to your character, not his. Oh, and it looks like it was she hid that. So this one, the redhead libertarian, brought it back up. Betraying your brother. I'm standing with your brother. Oh, I didn't know that lady was married to Andrew Cuomo. Jeez, bad decision. So yeah, that was the Kennedy press conference and the aftermath from it. If you go through, or when I go through my Twitter feed right now, like most of it is just people from the Harris camp, or not the Harris campaign, people from the JFK. Oh geez, I'm having an issue here. From the RFK campaign, being welcomed with open arms into the greater MAGA community, and it's just been a huge love fest that they're just so happy, and it's kind of crazy. Like this guy, the DNC effed up. They pissed off a massive movement that now is teaming up with MAGA to take our country back. There's a reckoning coming. The purple wave is going to turn red real quick. MAGA meets Make America Healthy Again. And yeah, I'm very hopeful that all the Kennedy supporters in the swing states will not only vote for Trump, but will bring a lot of their friends to vote for Trump as well. And after the debate where Trump just throttles Harris, I assume her support will dwindle further, making it a fairly easy win for Trump, a la Reagan's second election, where he won 300 electoral votes, I think. He won all the states except for, I think, Minnesota, which would be awesome if Trump could make that happen and win like New York and California, well, the entire West Coast, Illinois. Well, it would be a cathartic experience for everyone that's not a rabid leftist, I would say. Anyway, I'm running a little bit long and I'm rambling at this point. If you've liked this, please hit like, subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this and your thoughts about the Trump and Kennedy alliance, and how that will affect not only this election cycle, but if Trump is elected, how that will affect the future of this nation and Trump's presidency. Anyway, I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.